Hello there! In Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Philip tells the good news of Jesus Christ to an Ethiopian eunuch. The man joyfully accepted baptism from Philip and brought his new faith back to the Ethiopian court. He thereby began the legacy of African Christianity that continues to this day, a vibrant and growing family of faith with ancient roots and fascinating history. Although the Bible does not name this man, tradition gives his name as Simeon Bakos. Join us as we explore the world of ancient African Christianity that he originated. Join us as we follow along in Simeon's wake. Virtue is the real knowledge. Clement of Alexandria's Gnosticism. Much of this month's series has consisted of me emphatically asserting that there is not one single thing called Gnosticism. Instead, there was a variety of different traditions and beliefs that all came to be labeled as Gnostic, and each of those traditions had its own relationship to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most famous of the Christian so-called Gnostics. He's famous because, for starters, he is considered to be an Orthodox Christian by most, so his writings were never lost to us. He was one of the most brilliant writers of his day, and he had all the moral credibility that accompanies a convert to the faith. That's right. Today we are talking about that most knowledgeable of the Gnostic noetics, that lauded literate learner of lore, that adored Alexandrine, Clement of Alexandria. We're not sure exactly when Clement was born, but it was probably right around 150 AD. Some people say that he was born in Athens, others in Alexandria. His full name was Titus Flavius Clemens, which is a Latin name rather than a Greek one, which suggests that his family hailed from the western side of the empire. They may have also been related to an old imperial family, which, is pretty cool. We love a royal lineage. He'd do well in a Hallmark movie. Clement's parents were pagans, and he converted to Christianity as an adult. His brilliance was obvious to all, and he was well trained in literature and philosophy. Like many intellectuals of his age, he made his way to Alexandria so he could hang out with all the other big-brained types of the day. He taught at the famed catechetical school in Alexandria, which is where many of the best and brightest intellectuals of the Christian tradition studied, including Origen of Alexandria, who was Clement's student. The rest of Clement's life details are fuzzy. He became a priest sometime around 189 AD, so he's about 40, and then he dies by 215 AD, right around the age of 65. His influence was immense, and most of it was concentrated around the city of Alexandria. He was a very well-known and respected charismatic teacher in a city where charismatic teachers could go very far indeed. While we don't know too much about his life, there is one thing about Clement's personality that we know for certain. He could bite off more than he could chew. You see, Clement had planned to write this super awesome 3-part trilogy of theological works. The first is called The Exhortation, and it's written to non-Christians to explain why Christianity is super duper awesome and they should totally become Christians. The second book is called The Teacher, and it's about how Christians should live in the world. The third part of the trilogy is called Nothing, because it never happened. It was supposed to be called The Didaskalos, which is a fancy Greek word for teacher, and it was supposed to complement the more practical second book with some hefty intellectual foundations for the Christian life. But as far as we know, Clement never wrote the book. He certainly never finished it, maybe never even started. Instead, he wrote a very long book that is called The Miscellanies. Yeah, that's right. One of the greatest geniuses of the ancient world called his own book Miscellaneous. As an author who hates figuring out titles, I get it. Although, in fairness to Clement, he didn't call it that. His actual name for the book was Miscellanies of Notes of Revealed Knowledge in Accordance with the True Philosophy, which is even less appealing than just miscellanies. I mean, modern publishers would have eaten him alive. Clement's problems with executive function notwithstanding, the miscellanies, or the stromatis, as they are called in Greek, are really, really valuable for our purposes. Throughout the book, Clement outlines his vision for the true Gnostic Christian and opposes it to the vision of Valentinus and his teacher Basileides. As I said in the intro episode, Gnostic is a pretty ordinary Greek word that just means knowing or wise. As groups like the Sethians and Valentinians appropriated the word for their purposes, some Christians stopped using it. They felt the word was polluted by association. Clement took a different approach. Gnostic was simply too good a word to let the heretics have it. So instead, Clement laid out his own vision of a Gnostic Christian, one that the early church, by and large, accepted. The first part of the Stromatis talks a lot about how Christians are supposed to teach. This is mostly prologue, and he says the kind of stuff you'd expect him to say. You should teach for the benefit of others, not your own ego. The student should want to learn in order to become a better person, not just to feel good. And the teacher should speak in clear, comprehensible language that the hearers can understand. All well and good. But already, Clement has included a subtle jab at Valentinus and the rest. You've heard the gospel of truth. You've experienced the treatises of the great Seth. Would you say they are written in a clear, comprehensible language that is easy to understand? I'll pause for a minute so you can finish rolling on the floor laughing. Clement is already contrasting his approach with the other texts that we've studied. Other Gnostic Christians often prided themselves on keeping their wisdom secret. Not everyone could understand what they had to say. And that was by design. Some people were material, they simply were incapable of comprehension, and so they hid their truths behind riddles and cosmic myths and all manner of incomprehensible, seeming nonsense. Like, I don't know, writing out every vowel in your language 22 times for no apparent reason. For Clement, that's not teaching. That is a prideful display of ego, and it's designed to create a cult of personality, not to build up the truth. So he will have none of it. That being said, Clement is not an anti-intellectual. He knows that truth is difficult to find, and that the search is often confusing. That's why you don't make it harder than you need to with complicated prose. But philosophy, as practiced by the Greek pagans, is very good preparation for Christianity. In fact, Clement says the truths of philosophy are Christian truths. After all, God is truth, so all truth comes from God, whether we find it in the Bible, or in the pages of Homer, or out in the world by observation. He also supplies some fun allegories to support this and cites, who else? The master allegorist Philo of Alexandria. He says that Abraham, the father of faith, first produces a child with the Egyptian, Hagar. Egypt represents the secular world and all its learning. In Clement's day, this analogy must have seemed especially apt because Alexandria in Egypt was the intellectual center of the world. Hagar and Ishmael prepared the way for Isaac, the child of the promise, the child of faith. Now, there is a lot more to the first part than what I've told you, but very little of it relates to the word Gnostic, so you've got the main points. Yeah, speak in plain sentences, find truth everywhere you can. Okay, cool. Let's get on to part 2 and some of the arguments with the other Gnostics. Clement begins this part of the book by loudly asserting that he is not going to bother with all of those fancy turns of phrase and clever arguments that clever public speakers use. Which is exactly the way you begin your speech if you are a clever public speaker. You actually still see this all the time today. It's a very, very common move in politics. The minute somebody tells you that they are just going to tell it like it is without worrying about what some focus group told them to think, you know that what you are about to hear has been very carefully scripted. When they tell you that they are just going to tell the truth in plain speech, you can bet good money they have spent a lot of time and paid some writers very good money to hone and refine that plain speech. In the ancient world, this was so common that it had a fancy name. The Captatio Benevolentiae which literally means the capturing of goodwill. There were several forms of the captatio, but they all had the same basic idea: to get the audience on your side from the beginning. You established yourself as one of them, giving voice to their thoughts and feelings rather than some artificial, lifeless speech concocted by an elite. Now, of course, not all captatios functioned the exact same way. Sometimes, instead of bringing the speaker down to the audience's level, they'd elevate the audience to the speaker's level. I'll give you a modern example. Famed news anchor Tom Brokaw was the commencement speaker for my graduation from college at Vanderbilt University. Now, Vanderbilt's big football rival is the University of Tennessee. Now, I'm using the term rival loosely because, well, if you know anything about American football, you know that Vanderbilt is not exactly top tier. I mean, we're not terrible. We're fine. However, we happen to be in the Southeastern Conference, or SEC, which is home to many of the best teams in the country. Fine usually doesn't cut it against them. My freshman year, Vanderbilt went 6-6 in our season, and people were ecstatic. A 50% win record was the best we had done in decades. All of this is my way of saying that our rivalry with the University of Tennessee is kind of one-sided and doesn't really go in our favor. Anyway, back to the commencement speech. Tom Brokaw got on stage and began the speech to us by saying that he liked being at Vanderbilt because in his speech he could use all the big words that they didn't understand at the University of Tennessee. We went wild with laughter. He had captured our goodwill. Imagine how betrayed I felt when one day I stumbled across him giving a commencement address at another university and using the exact same joke. Yuck! We weren't special at all. Well, fine, Tom. Your speech wasn't even that good anyway. You didn't give us any words of wisdom for life. You just promoted your national service idea that never went anywhere. So there. You've lost my goodwill now, Tom. You may be thinking that the captatio benevolentiae is kind of a cynical thing, just a way of manipulating your audience into liking you. I mean, it certainly can be. I think it kind of was in Tom Brokaw's case, but it doesn't have to be. A good captatio sets up the speaker's argument and authentically begins to move the audience and speaker toward the mutual conclusion. That is what Clement is doing. Because a lot of his argument will be that non-Christian philosophers and heretics spend way too much time wrangling over particular words, and not nearly enough time focusing on the hard, important work of moral formation, repentance, and new life. That's what constitutes true knowledge. Which is why the first thing Clement wants to do is explain the importance of faith. Clement cites the book of Hebrews, which famously calls faith the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. That's from chapter 11, verse 2, if you're keeping score at home. This famous definition is also famously unclear. Is it just saying that faith is about being certain something is true, even when you can't see it? Well, not really, at least according to Clement. For him, faith is something more like a willingness to be persuaded when new evidence comes to light. We have all been in an argument with somebody who was not willing to be convinced by anything. And we all know how pointless that argument is. No matter what you say, no matter what evidence you bring, the other person is going to find a way to discount it. They're just not open to being persuaded. On the other hand, you may have had the pleasure of talking with someone who was willing to be convinced. They may be skeptical, but they're willing to listen to your arguments. They may even consider your arguments or try to make a better argument for your side because they genuinely want to know the truth. That's faith in the Clementine sense. For Clement, faith is, and I quote, preconception by the will, an act of consenting to religion, end quote. The Greek word he uses for preconception is actually prolepsis, and it's where our word proleptic comes from. Faith is kind of an anticipation of God's truth. See, the person with faith has made a choice deep down that they will respond to the truth when they see it. They care about truth for truth's sake. They aren't trying to feel superior to anyone. They don't have their ego invested in the answer. They just want to know the truth. And so when they get evidence of it, they respond. Now, this idea of faith is very important because it's something that the Valentinians do not have. You may remember that Valentinus divided people into 3 groups: the spiritual, the soulful, and the material. For Valentinus, that middle class, the sort of average non-Gnostic Christian, was soulful, and had to be saved by faith rather than the gnosis that the spiritual folks had. Moreover, the differences between these types had to do with the way they were created. The spiritual have that spark of divinity within them. The material have no spark of divinity. And the soulful in the middle have, I don't know, actually, like half a spark or something? It's not really clear how that's supposed to work. But anyway, the point is that people's faiths are determined by what they are and not what they choose. Clement thinks that this is all hot garbage. It's hot garbage for many reasons, but the primary piece of refuse flambé is that if Valentinus is right, then any notion of free will is utterly meaningless. And if free will is meaningless, then so is the whole Christian moral life. Now, we saw before that Valentinus does have a moral system. He wants the Gnostic spiritual believer to help others. But the Gnostic spiritual believer only makes the choice to help others because of the divine spark within. It's not a free choice, you understand. The Gnostic believer will always choose to help because it's who they are. The material person will not and cannot make this choice because they lack the capacity. So the whole idea that Christian faith might make you a better person is just bunk, and with it the whole sacramental system. Or as Clement memorably puts it, and I quote, "What has happened to repentance for previous lack of faith leading to remission of sins? The result is this: no baptismal boon from the Word, no sealing of blessing, no Son, no Father." End quote. As a side note, the phrase baptismal boon is extremely fun and should be used in the church way more often. Really, we should use the phrase boon more often in general. I mean, it just works. There's a bakery in Indianapolis that calls their rewards program Bakehouse Boons. I don't go there that often anymore because it's a half-hour drive away from me and it's kind of a hipster paradise and I'm not cool enough to hang with them. And also because they have an annoying habit of selling out of the pastry I want right before I place my order. Like, right before. Like, there will be one left in the window, and the person in front of me will order it, and I'll see the server snatch it out of the window, leaving only a sad and lonely sign for my sad and lonely stomach. But the point is, they notice it's been a while, and they send me emails that say things like, "You have a bakehouse boon waiting for you." And I think, "Oh, a boon? I want a boon." And then I make a trip. How much fuller would our churches be if we told people, "You have a baptismal boon waiting for you"? Much to consider. But Clement would probably tell me that I am focusing too much on baked goods and not enough on the next part of his argument, which is that Greek philosophers were just copying Moses' homework. Clement wants to establish that the best of Greek philosophy is present in the Old Testament, and to defend the Old Testament against the claims of those, like the Sethians or the Marcionites, who said that it was the revelation of an inferior or even evil God. He proceeds by pointing out a whole bunch of passages from Plato and Aristotle and other Greek philosophers, and then saying, "Whoa, the Bible says, like, the same thing. Plato thinks you should be virtuous and live a good life. Well, so does the Bible." It's kind of like the youth pastor strategy of pointing out some popular, pop culture thingamabob and then tying it into the Bible with a lame joke. There aren't really any lame jokes here, but it's the same basic idea. I'm not going to bore you by reciting all of these passages, just know that there are a lot of them. And Clement works really, really hard to make his point. He then points out that the texts of Scripture are older than Plato and Aristotle and all the rest, so they must have gotten their ideas from the Bible. This is a pretty common motif in early Christian literature. In the ancient world, what was older was considered better. So if the Bible was earlier than the philosophers but taught the same thing as them, then it would be considered better by default. Okay, so that's basically the defense of the Bible. What is the true Christian, or the Gnostic Christian as Clement calls them, supposed to look like? Well, true Christianity consists in three things. Number one is contemplation, meaning prayer and knowledge of the one true God. Number two is fulfilling the commandments. No killing people for fun or committing massive financial fraud and calling yourself a Christian. You've got to at least try to live by the rules. Third and finally, the formation of a virtuous character. The bread and butter of Christianity is moral growth. Where moral growth is missing, something has gone wrong. While Clement doesn't explicitly name the Valentinians as his opponents here, he is attempting to contrast his vision of the Christian life with that of Valentinus. The true Christian lives by faith. In other words, by a willingness to receive and be transformed by the saving knowledge of God. Valentinians think they have that knowledge already, and even when they do know something, they don't let it transform them. St. Paul warned of a knowledge that puffs up rather than builds up. This is precisely what the Valentinians have acquired. They imagine that their knowledge qualifies them to be a spiritual elite bound for the glory of the highest heaven. The earnest sincerity of the true Gnostic, who strives to improve in virtue and love, is the furthest thing from their minds. Ironic. They thought they were immune to spiritual death, but they fell prey to it through their arrogance. Clement compares them to Cain, the second son of Adam and Eve, and the first murderer. That, by the way, must have really annoyed the Sethians. They were one son off from being compared to the interesting one. The Bible says that Cain lived in the land of Nade, which comes from a root word meaning disturbance. Thus it is with these false Gnostics, Clement says. They think themselves superior, but their hearts and homes are full of discord. Now that Clement has established how central moral character and right living are to the Christian life, he gives an interesting little classification of three different kinds of errors. These three errors are misfortune, going wrong, and crime. Now, the word he uses for going wrong is hamartia, which is the Greek word we often translate as sin, but its most literal meaning is to miss a target. How are these three related? Well, a misfortune is when you wind up doing something wrong without any reason, and often without you having intended to do it at all. Lots of Greek tragedies involve misfortune of this sort. You are in a war and attack somebody who looked like an enemy, but he turned out to be your best friend. Whoops. Misfortune is bad, but since it involves no ill intent, it's the least serious of the three. Then there is going wrong, in which you do something bad out of a combination of ignorance and inability. You didn't know what to do, or you lacked the power to do it. For example, if you are at your friend Sam's birthday party and he has bought a whole bunch of Roman candles for you to fire off, and you and your teenage friends are shooting them into the sky and having a grand old time, and then one of them shoots a Roman candle a little too low over someone else's head, and then that person takes offense and aims their Roman candle directly at the offender, and then all of a sudden everybody is shooting fireworks at each other like you're in some kind of wizard duel, you can safely assume that something has gone wrong. Or if you and your friend Sam have built a potato cannon by supergluing pieces of PVC pipe together and filling the firing chamber with bug spray, and you are happily spending a summer evening firing potatoes into the night sky, but you fire it too many times in a row, and then the potato cannon comes apart the next time you shoot it, and there's a little fireball in between the two of you, and then a minute later you're on the ground with tinnitus in your ear that won't stop, and you can see your friend Sam in the pale moonlight bent over and clutching his chest. Well, that may be misfortune the first time. When your friend Sam calls you a week later and invites you to fire it again, and you accept, and in the middle of firing the potato cannon, you casually say, "So, you fixed the superglue issue, right? You, put screws in the pipe or something?" And he says, "Oh, nah, I just glued it together again," and then fires another starchy projectile. That would be going wrong. You may not have known the problem, but you should have known at that point. Hypothetically, of course. My mom listens to these episodes. Hi, Mom! Just remember, I got through high school with all my limbs attached. Crime, the third category, is exactly what it sounds like. You know it's wrong, you have the power not to do it, and you do it anyway. It's the worst offense of all three, and also the easiest to avoid. Clement gives some very interesting examples of how the laws of the Old Testament encourage us to grow in virtue, and specifically in compassion and self-control. He cites some of the laws restricting the marriage of captive women. In Deuteronomy, for instance, it instructs Israelite soldiers that when they capture a woman in battle, they are not allowed to marry her straight away, which was a common practice in antiquity. Instead, they had to give her a 30-day mourning period, in which time the woman was allowed to grieve for her former city and life and family however she wished. And if she wanted to, she could make life a real pain for her captor. I mean, imagine some woman wandering around your house wearing black, shaving her head, weeping and mourning loudly like a ghost out of the pages of Jane Eyre. And you can't do anything about it. The law prevents you. She gets to mourn however she wants. Clement puts it more delicately than that, noting that just because a soldier lusts after a captive, that doesn't mean he gets to have her. There is a cooling off period, and if the woman chooses, she can make things really cool during that time. If the soldier still wants to marry her after 30 days, he can, but he has no right to sell her into slavery or generally force her to act like a captive. She is his wife now, and she is treated like that. Now, I, for one, would prefer that women not be forced to marry their captors at all, and I suspect Clement does too. But Clement also knows that war is war, and the forced marriage of captive women was a universal practice in ancient times. His point was that even when God's law permits something regrettable, it moderates the practice, and it encourages us to be more gentle and more compassionate. We even see this with animals. In Exodus, it tells us that if you see an enemy's animal that has gotten loose, you are required to bring it back to them. No ifs, ands, or buts, and no putting it off. You can't let the animal suffer by watching it wander around lost before you go help it, and you can't let your enemy suffer the loss of the animal either. You are also required to treat your own animals with care. For example, you can't muzzle the ox that you're using to plow your field. Why? Well, because if you muzzle the ox, then it can't eat any of the grain you're harvesting. That's mean. The ox is working hard for you. It's probably hungry. It probably wants a snack. So give it a snack. In Simeon's Wake is now brought to you by pet food. Are your pets enjoying the most scrumptious meal of all time? Not unless they're eating Bibble, the deity-approved, scripturally mandated act of nutritional kindness that will have your pet begging for seconds and thirds. Theologically engineered to have the perfect blend of allegory and biblical truth, the Bibble supports all your animal's dietary needs so you can get back to what really matters, growing in virtue and telling Valentinus to shove it. Don't wait. Get your pet the biblically delicious food it deserves today. In one especially moving moment, Clement also points out that Scripture does not permit you to sacrifice animals who are less than a week old. Now, if you are sacrificing infant animals, you're probably in fairly dire straits to begin with. You're basically sacrificing a whole bunch of future potential to meet a present religious obligation. But even in such circumstances, you are not allowed to take a baby from its mother. Even animals deserve at least a week with their young. So no matter how pressing the human need is, you leave the infants alone for at least 7 days. Anything else is unnatural. I quite like this bit of Clement. His point is that compassion is not just for humans. It's something we do for all living beings. In fact, compassion is rational and natural. Animals naturally care for their young. It's unnatural to deprive them of that. Did Clement understand what modern science knows? Did he know that many animals, especially mammals, grieve the loss of their young? Perhaps, perhaps not. In some ways, I find it more compelling that it doesn't matter if the animal grieves or not. We are compassionate for compassion's sake. We protect the young and feed the hungry because that's what God does. Whether the recipient feels something is a secondary matter. This compassion is one of the hallmarks of the true Gnostic. The true Gnostic imitates God not so much in knowledge, although there's a bit of that, but in virtue, through continence, patience, righteous living, mastery over emotions, sharing with others, and doing good in deed and in word. Now, Clement knows that virtue is not something that just happens. It requires training and dedication. The Greek word for that training is askesis, and it's where our word ascetical comes from. Clement emphasizes the importance of every Christian being trained in virtue. That training comes primarily through mastering your passions. Now, the word passion in ancient Christian literature is kind of a whole situation. There are lots and lots of arguments about what exactly it means. Whatever it means, it does not mean what it means today. Nowadays, we think of passion as something that gets you really excited in a positive way, like when you talk about a passion project. But that is not what the word meant historically. Historically, the word had to do with suffering. Think of another name for the crucifixion and the suffering beforehand. What do we call it? We call it the Passion of the Christ. While accounts vary a bit, in Clement's world, a passion is a strong negative emotion that overtakes you in a way that makes you lose control. Let's say you are stuck in traffic and you are annoyed and you mutter, "Man, traffic is slow today." That's not a passion, it's just a feeling. But let's say you'd been having a really bad day and this traffic jam was the last straw and you felt something snap inside of you and all of a sudden you are honking your horn, screaming at the other drivers, and when another driver pulls over to talk to you, you grab the hunting crossbow out of your trunk and shoot him with it, going to prison and winding up on a 60-minute special that will be shown to traumatized Midwestern teens attending their driver's ed class. Oh, and to top it all off, you're a deacon in your local Baptist church. Or at least you were. I'm guessing after they saw that 60-minute special, you weren't anymore. Anyways, that's not the point. The point is that behavior would be a passion. Now, obviously, most passions are not quite as dramatic as that example, but you've experienced them. A sadness so great that it feels like a weight on your chest that paralyzes you. An anger that makes you snap. A fear so overwhelming that you'd rather die than face it. Clement's idea is that if we are going to be good people, we have to learn to get a handle on these passions. That's not his idea alone, mind you. It's a commonplace in the ancient world. And it makes sense. Most people aren't exactly paragons of virtue when they are frothing at the mouth with rage. It's hard to help others if your sadness is so overwhelming you can't get out of bed. So Clement recommends that Christians practice self-control so they can manage and overcome their passions. You know who doesn't recommend that? Valentinus and his teacher Basileides. For them, the passions are not products of our emotions. They are the influence of foreign spirits that get stuck on the Gnostic spirit. These foreign spirits have decided that it is fun to imitate animals like wolves or apes or lions or goats, and they get into the human soul and they try to make it act like an animal. I am not making this up. On Clement's account, for Valentinus, moral growth happens through exorcism. You exorcise the person to get the bad animal spirits out so that they can behave like a human again. As far as Clement is concerned, this is a mockery of Christian life. It basically tells you that you don't have to try. If you do something wrong, it's not your fault, it's the fault of the monkey god residing within you. In Simeon's Wake, brought to you by Avoiding Accountability. Now, of course, all that is bad enough. It's bad enough that Valentinus and his ilk don't really care about virtue. But their greatest sin is far worse. They don't care about true love. You see, marriage is what brings us into the third part of the stromatise. Clement is very mad about all of these so-called Gnostics and their incorrect opinions about marriage. He lists several of the opinions that we've talked about already. As you know, the Valentinians are pro-marriage, but so much that they kind of marry everything, even their guardian angel. And they justify their marriages by looking to how all the aeons get married to each other instead of looking at God's good commandments. Basileides and his followers, on the other hand, looked down on marriage and thought that it was better to be single. Clement goes on to mention a couple of other thinkers, Carpocrates and Epiphanes, who apparently tried to start some kind of free love commune that Clement definitely does not approve of. And then there are several Greek tragedians and philosophers who say that life is all pain and suffering, and it would really be better not to be born at all, so marriage is a bad time. No word on whether or not those philosophers spent too much time listening to the screamo music of the early 2000s. For Clement, all of these opinions are wrong. And he points out that all of these different groups go wrong in two different ways. Some inappropriately indulge in licentiousness. No desire can be gratified every single time. That's just not how it works. You may want to go to sleep in the middle of a boring class, but you shouldn't. You may want to eat every bit of food you see, but that won't be good for your health. So why should sexual desire be any different? There is a time and a place where it is appropriate, and there are times and places where it isn't. But then Clement turns to address the other group of folks who go wrong, and these are the ones who endorse an inappropriate rigorism. While they may think they are living a particularly holy life, in fact they are giving in to their arrogance. They have become full of themselves, and Clement has no patience for it. Oh wow, you guys want to be disciplined. That's great. Can you be disciplined without tearing apart the marriage that God has joined together? Oh, so you think you're already living in the resurrection age, so you shouldn't marry? Well, they don't eat food in the resurrection age either. Want to try that one? Oh, neat. You think that sexual intercourse pollutes people? Tell me, how exactly did you come to be born? Wouldn't you be polluted too? Then Clement goes on to make one of the most touching and, to my knowledge, unparalleled statements in ancient Christianity. He says, quote, "Personally, I think the seed coming from consecrated people is sacred too." End quote. Think about that. Just a century earlier, Philo of Alexandria was walking around Clement's city, calling the body a prison and a corpse. And most ancient philosophies were not exactly super fond of the body. The body got in the way of understanding and virtue. The body is what you needed to overcome in order to attain any real happiness. And bodily acts, sex above all, dragged you back down to the muck and mire of earth. And these folks did have evidence to back up their claims. I suspect that there is no one who has grown to adulthood without seeing at least one relationship ruined by physical intimacy. Too much of it, not enough of it, or with the wrong person, or in a relationship that's just not right. Most of us know what it is like to be so overcome with desire for another that we can't think straight, or think about anything else for that matter. So it is not for nothing that those ancient philosophers thought that our desires, our bodies, were the problem. But against all that, Clement maintains the opposite. Marriage is a good thing. Sex is a good thing. It is the literal stuff of life, the means by which God brings new life into the world. And you know what? If God has made two people holy, then the sex between them is holy too. It's a remarkably humane and moving view. I hate to editorialize, but I tend to think the church would be a much saner place if more people took Clement's view. So with all this said, Clement sums up his own view of the matter. For him, the goal of life is self-control. Self-control does not mean having desires and holding out against them as long as you can. It means freedom from desire altogether, which cannot happen except by the grace of God. For example, up on Mount Sinai, Moses fasted for 40 days and nights. That is not a thing a human body can normally do. It was only by God's grace that Moses was able to avoid hunger and thirst for that time. But even then, other bodily needs were met. For instance, Moses still wore clothes. So he didn't have complete freedom from all his needs, and that is okay. But the goal is to be free of desires where we can. Those who want to get rid of marriage and sex altogether are trying to hold out against their desires, to delay them as long as possible. But that isn't the point of the Christian life. They're making themselves miserable for no real purpose. Instead, Clement says, the same basic rule holds no matter what kind of pleasure we are talking about. Whether we are talking about eating or sleep or sex, the rule is this: never act from desire, but from concentrating on necessities. Don't eat food because it looks good. Eat because you know your body needs nutrition and you want to care for it. Don't sleep with your spouse out of lust, but do it as an expression of your love and a desire, perhaps, to have children with them. I'm fascinated by this. In general, I'm fascinated by how Christians think about desire in all its forms, and since this is my podcast, I'm going to editorialize for a minute. Those of you who know me in real life know that I'm a mental health therapist as well as a priest. And the difference between Clement and his rigorous opponents look a lot to me like the differences between different kinds of therapy. Some therapies out there are very behavior-based. They assume that your desires can't change, that whatever is bothering you on the inside really is just there. You're just kind of stuck with it. So the best thing you can do is learn techniques to help you control them. For instance, one of the most popular therapies out there for OCD is called exposure response prevention. Basically, you put the person in a situation where they feel compelled to do something. Clean the room, check the stove, wash their hands, recite their mantra, and then you tell them not to do it. You train them to hold out against that compulsion until their brain desensitizes to it. Oftentimes, you might say something like, "Look, you're probably never going to like seeing the computer dirty, or touching plastic, or leaving the house and not checking 15 times whether the stove is off. But you can train yourself not to give in to your compulsions, and over time they will bother you less." The other approach actually focuses less on the compulsion and more on the roots of the desires that are behind those compulsions. What we often see with an obsessive person is a profound and painful lack of any felt sense of safety. The world feels so incredibly dangerous to them that they unconsciously construct a set of restrictive rules. If they follow the rules, they create a small bit of safety for themselves. Of course, they don't realize that this is what they're doing. All these processes happen unconsciously and automatically. What the therapist does in this model is gently bring those unconscious processes to light. Doing so helps the suffering person realize the patterns they're stuck in. And if the relationship with the therapist is good enough and safe enough, it provides some of that feeling of safety that the person has been craving. And they internalize that feeling and take it with them outside of the therapy room and into the world. Because their desire for safety has been satisfied a bit more in an appropriate way, they rely on their compulsions less. They find more freedom. Now, Clement was obviously not a psychotherapist, but I do think he is pointing to something more like that second kind of therapy, which happens to be the kind of therapy that I do, so naturally I am very glad to recruit Clement onto my team. All joking aside, I think Clement has a sense that if a human being is to be happy, our desires have to be changed. Now, the way he wants them to change may not be exactly the same as what a modern therapist would offer. Most folks probably want a little bit more of a spark in their marriage than saying, "Hello, spouse, let us perform our conjugal duties as an expression of love and a means for the continuance of the race." But I do think Clement understands that self-control only happens when we can have some freedom from our desires, and that freedom requires us to gratify our desires a bit. If we deny them too much, they become more powerful, more insistent, and eventually they overwhelm us like a tidal wave. Real self-control is giving our bodies and souls what they need, which is not necessarily the same thing as what they think they want. But once our basic needs are met, our desires become less overwhelming, and then we can do what we decide is right, rather than what our starved bodies are craving. Now, there is more to Clement's work. A lot more, actually. We only touched on the first 3 parts of his miscellanies, and there are 8 of them in total. However, what we've discussed is enough to give you a sense of how Clement reworks the idea of the Gnostic Christian. To sum up, Clement has 2 main beefs with the Gnosticism of Valentinus and the rest. Beef number 1 is that they emphasize the importance of secret knowledge that is only available to an elite few. Clement agrees that knowledge is an important part of the Christian message. For starters, you have to know who Jesus is, his relationship to the Father, and that whole dying for your sins and rising again on the 3rd day thing is kind of important too. But all of that kind of stuff is part of the public record. You can go to any church and find it preached about, or hear it publicly read from the scriptures. Valentinians, Sethians, and the others instead reserved their mysteries for an elite few. It was hidden behind riddles and mantras and a general sense that only a certain type of person could access those truths. Now, were there some truths that Clement of Alexandria only taught to advanced Christians? Yeah, probably. But those had to do with advanced points of theology that did not relate to salvation. Remember, Valentinus and others thought that if you didn't know all of their secret knowledge, you weren't going to get through the celestial realms of the aeons to the highest heaven. For Clement, there was no such idea. And this showcases one of the other differences we've seen before. You know their general vibe, and so you know that their emphasis is not really on the life of Christ at all. Most of these texts are concerned about the relationships between the aeons. The four Gospels are not really all that concerned about such matters. I mean, they care about the relationship between Jesus and the Father, but you won't find the canonical Bible pondering about whether the aeon of thought or profundity or grace or church came when, or what the precise thoughts and feelings of the Archangel Gabriel were. It's just not their focus. Which leads to Clement's second beef. By focusing so relentlessly on the celestial sphere, the other Gnostics have forgotten the bread and butter of the Christian moral life. They don't encourage people to put effort into becoming better. They don't recognize the importance of free will. They think that if they can just understand the nature of the heavenly world, and which animal spirit has gotten into your body last week, then we can fix all our problems. It simply doesn't work like that. The true Christian Gnostic is the one who sincerely seeks moral progress, falling neither into indulgence nor becoming an uptight, over-restricted busybody. The true Gnostic focuses on the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ and transmits it to others in faithful, simple language. All of which leads us back to the fundamental question. Can you be a Gnostic and a Christian, or a Gnostic Christian? Well, it really all depends on what you mean by the terms. Some self-described Gnostics felt their beliefs were perfectly compatible with Christianity, and there were some cases, like that of Clement, in which the church felt the same. Other folks were not so conciliatory. Some Christians did not recognize Gnostic movements as part of their family of faith. Some Gnostic movements returned the disdain, and eventually, for the most part, the two parted ways. The Christian church went on to continue its odyssey through history, and most of the so-called Gnostic movements eventually died out, remembered only in the pages of their adversaries until the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Codex. It's an extraordinary tale, and one worth remembering in detail, not least because all the ripples, crashes, and mergers between these various groups form a critical and constitutive part of Simeon's Wake. Thank you for listening to In Simeon's Wake, part of the Earth and Altar Podcast Network. If you liked the episode, please leave it a review and drop a like on that episode at your earliest convenience, or even before. It's nice. If you'd like to support this work, head on over to patreon.com/Ben Wyatt. That's patreon.com/Ben Wyatt, WYATT. Until next time, stay curious.